Continuing now with F. Bruce's The Canon of Scripture. In our last session, we finished chapter 5, the Christian canon of the Old Testament in the East. So in this session, we begin chapter 6, the Christian canon of the Old Testament in the Latin West. The Bible began to be translated into Latin, so far as can be ascertained, in the latter half of the 2nd century A.D. in the Roman province of Africa. Province of Africa was Latin-speaking, so far as official usage is concerned. This was preeminently true of Roman Carthage, refounded as a colony in 46 BC. The need for a Latin version of the Scriptures was realized here decades before a similar need was felt in Rome itself. The Jewish community in Rome was largely Greek-speaking, and so was the Church from the first beginnings of Roman Christianity in the 40s of the 1st century until the end of the 2nd century. A footnote here, Bruce says Victor, Bishop of Rome towards the end of the 2nd century, is said to have been the first Roman bishop to write in Latin. The first Christian treatise in Latin to have survived is Novatian, Novatin, on the Trinity, written shortly before AD 250. In this treatise, all the Christological proof texts are drawn from the Old Testament. Until Jerome produced a new translation of the Old Testament from the Hebrew text at the end of the 4th century, the Latin Old Testament was a rendering of the Septuagint, including the Septuagintal Plus. There was little, if anything, to indicate to readers of the Old Latin version that the Septuagintal Plus stood on a different footing from the rest of the Old Testament. Footnote says the books in the possession of the Silitan martyrs, circa AD 180, along with the letters of Paul, may have been parts of the Old Testament. Tertullian. Tertullian of Carthage is the first writer to be considered among the Latin fathers, so that's very significant. Let me repeat that. Tertullian of Carthage is the first writer to be considered among the Latin fathers. He flourished at the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd. He calls the two testaments instruments, using the word in its legal sense. The Old Testament is, quote, the whole instrument of Jewish literature, end quote. He gives the impression that he knows exactly what it contains, although he nowhere gives a list of its contents. His Old Testament was evidently coextensive with the Septuagint, including the Septuagint Plus. Indeed, in one place he implies that it might justifiably be extended beyond the limits of the Septuagint. It is not enough to locate and list quotations from various fringe books or allusions to them. A Christian writer may quote works to which he would not dream of ascribing divine authority, as Paul, for example, quotes Menander in 1 Corinthians 15:33. Footnote says the line, evil communications corrupt good manners, in both the Authorized Version and the King James Version, comes from Menander's comedy, Thais, Thais. It had probably passed into general circulation as a proverbial saying, like so many lines from Shakespeare. The quotation in our day. The quotation or allusion must be accompanied by words which show that the writer did regard it as Holy Scripture. Thus, when Tertullian, in Against Marcion, quotes, "Come, my bride, from Lebanon," in Canticle 4:8, it is plain that he acknowledges the Song of Songs as divinely inspired, for he takes the words to be addressed by Christ to the church. He regards wisdom as a genuine work of Solomon, and the letter of Jeremiah as authentically Jeremiah's. The Song of the Three Hebrews and the story of Bel and the dragon are to him integral parts of Daniel. On the other hand, we cannot prove that he regarded Judith as canonical, because he cites Judith, who remained unmarried after her husband's death, as an example of monogamy, or First Maccabees, because he refers to the freedom fighters' resolution to resist their assailants even on the Sabbath, to show that the weekly Sabbath was intended to be a temporary provision. But the probability is that he did regard Judith and First Maccabees with the rest of the Septuagintal Plus as part of the ancient instrument. The Apocalypse of Ezra, 4th Ezra, was never included in the Septuagint. For this reason, its Greek text has not survived. In a footnote, he says its Christian prologue and epilogue are sometimes designated 5th and 6th Ezra, respectively. When God says in 4th Ezra 7:28 that, quote, "My son the Messiah will be revealed, and then after 400 years die," this is the expected Messiah of David's line, 4th Ezra 12:32, but has nothing to do with the Christian Messiah, even if the Latin version calls him Jesus in 7:28. So he says the Apocalypse of Ezra was never included in the Septuagint. For this reason, its Greek text has not survived. But Tertullian knows and accepts its account of Ezra's restoring the sacred scriptures of Israel, which had been destroyed at the time of the Babylonian conquest. Another work which found no place in the Septuagint was the composite apocalyptic work called First Enoch. And a footnote explains, since Enoch, whose name in Hebrew may mean initiated, was translated from earth to heaven, he was envisaged as a suitable recipient of special revelations. And he cites here Genesis 5:24 and Hebrews 11:5. Two other collections of Enoch literature are Second Enoch, the Book of the Secrets of Enoch, composed in Greek but extant only in a Slavonic version, and Third Enoch, also called the Hebrew Enoch, or the Book of the Palaces, a work of Jewish mysticism. All three are translated with introductions in J.H. Charlesworth's The Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha. I'll say it that way. So he says another work which found no place in the Septuagint was the composite apocalyptic work called First Enoch. Only about 1/3 of its Greek text has survived. The Ethiopic Church is the only part of Christendom to have canonized it. For this reason, it is only in the Ethiopic version that it is extant in its entirety. A number of early Christian writers mention it with reservations. And a footnote says, for example, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who we discussed in the last session. But Tertullian approved of it and would have been willing to see it included in the ancient instrumentum. He knew that he was incompetent to include it on his own initiative. The canonization of religious writings is not an individual responsibility. One reason for his approval of it was the fact that it was quoted, evidently as a genuine prophecy of the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, by Jude, who calls himself, quote, servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, Jude 1:14 Jude 1 and 14. But that in itself would not have been enough. Others were disposed to exclude Jude from the New Testament because of its quoting a work of doubtful authenticity. There was the further and quite potent reason that Tertullian's attitude to the subject of his treatise on women's dress was reinforced by the statement in 1 Enoch 8:1 that it was Azazel, leader of the fallen angels. A footnote explains that Azazel appears in Leviticus 16:8, 10, and 26 as the being to whom the scapegoat was dedicated on the annual Day of Atonement. So again, there was a further and quite potent reason that Tertullian's attitude to the subject of his treatise on women's dress was reinforced by the statement in 1 Enoch 8:1 that it was Azazel, leader of the fallen angels, who first introduced women to bracelets, decorations, antimony for eyeshadow, ornamentation, the beautifying of the eyelids, all kinds of precious stones, and all coloring tinctures. The second section of 1 Enoch, comprising chapters 37 through 71, is commonly called the Parables of Enoch. It is of different authorship from chapters 1 through 36, and probably of later date. In it, God is repeatedly called, quote, the Lord of Spirits. Tertullian gives this title to God in his work Against Marcion. Actually, he intends to quote 2 Corinthians 3:18, from the Lord who is the Spirit. But he quotes it from memory, and his memory has been influenced by this similar expression, which he may owe to acquaintance with the parables of Enoch. Since 1st Enoch is not included in the Hebrew Bible, nor yet in the Septuagint, which was of course a Jewish translation, Tertullian hazards the unworthy suspicion of a kind which he was not alone among early Christians in entertaining, that it was rejected by Jews because it spoke of Christ. He may have had in mind the figure of the Son of Man, who appears here and there throughout the parables of Enoch. But that Son of Man is not Jesus. He turns out, in fact, to be identified with Enoch himself. So, I have to be careful when a writer uses a certain phrase that we may identify in one way because of our reading of familiar scripture that's familiar to us. We have to be careful of imposing that understanding and interpretation on writings outside of Scripture, because they may not mean the same thing, may not refer to the same thing. Footnote says, at the end of the parables of Enoch, Enoch is transported to, quote, the heaven of heavens, and told by an angel, you are that Son of Man. So, Son of Man, as used by Enoch, refers to himself. A compilation to which Tertullian and other early Christian writers assigned genuine prophetic authority was the Sibylline oracles. The Sibylline oracles, which they knew, were Jewish and Christian poems composed in an oracular idiom at various times between 200 BC and AD 250. They are edited and translated by J.J. Collins in the Old Testament. I still have a problem with this word, pseudepigrapha. But those writers who quote them took them at face value. So let me go back to that sentence now, before the footnote. A compilation to which Tertullian and other early Christian writers assigned genuine prophetic authority was the Sibylline oracles. The Sibylline oracles, which they knew, were Jewish and Christian poems composed in an oracular idiom, in other words, as in the manner of oracles, at various times between 200 BC and AD 250. But those writers who quote them took them at face value as the genuine prophecies of an ancient pagan prophetess, the Sibyl, S-I-B-Y-L, says Tertullian, quote, who antedated all literature and was a true prophetess of truth, end quote. In an attack on idolatry, he quotes from the third Sibylline oracle, written by Jews in Egypt about the middle of the 2nd century BC, to the effect that in the 10th generation after the flood, quote, there reigned Kronos, Titan, and Iapetos, the mighty children of Gaia and Uranus. Tertullian gives the Latin equivalents of those names, Saturn, Titan, and Iapetus, the mighty children of Terra and Calum. But it was not suggested that the Sibylline oracles should be included in the Jewish or Christian Holy Scriptures. To those who took them at face value, they constituted a parallel body of divine prophecy, communicated and transmitted through Gentiles. Hence, the medieval hymn Dies Irae, D-I-E-S-I-R-A-E, speaks of, quote, that day of wrath, that dreadful day when heaven and earth shall pass away, as David and the Sibyl say. Footnote says the David reference may be to Psalm 102:26. The Sibyl reference is to Oracle 2, 196 through 213, which describes the destruction of the universe in the final conflagration. And he cites to see 2 Peter 3, 10 through 12 on that. David, representing Old Testament prophecy, stands here alongside the Sibyl as foretelling the final dissolution of the created universe. Tertullian may stand for all the Latin fathers before the time of Jerome. The Bible which they used provided them with no means of distinguishing those parts which belonged to the Hebrew canon from those which were found only in the Septuagint. It appears that in several of their copies, Baruch was appended to Jeremiah rather than distinguished as a separate book. Cyprian, Hilary, and Ambrose all quote from Baruch, but ascribe the words quoted to Jeremiah. Now we turn to Jerome. Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus, to give Jerome his formal Latin name, was born in AD 346 or 347 at Stridon in Dalmatia. His parents, who were Christians, were able to give him an excellent education. He came to Rome in his teens to perfect his classical studies in the school of Donatus, one of the most celebrated grammarians of his day. In due course, he became a master of Greek as well as Latin literature. As a result of a nearly fatal illness at Antioch in 374, he resolved thenceforth to devote himself to biblical, no longer to secular, literature. Footnote says it was at this time that he had his vision of the day of judgment, in which he was charged with being a Ciceronian rather than a Christian. He spent the next 4 or 5 years leading the life of a hermit in the desert east of Antioch. He pursued sacred learning unremittingly and began to study Hebrew with the aid of a Jewish Christian. At the same time, he familiarized himself with the Aramaic vernacular of the country regions around him. After this period of seclusion, he returned to Antioch and was ordained to the presbyterate. I hope I'm saying that right. He was present in 381 at the Council of Constantinople and went from there to Rome, perhaps to attend the council held there in 382 to review the acts of the Constantinopolitan Council. That's an important date to keep in mind. 381 and 382, Council of Constantinople, and review the acts of the Constantinopolitan Council. In Rome, he was invited to stay on and give secretarial and other help to Pope Damasus. Among the services which Damasus asked him to perform was the revision of the existing Latin Bible. So this is Jerome, who was asked by Pope Damasus to help revise the existing Latin Bible. A necessary service because of the unsatisfactory condition of the text. According to Jerome himself, there were almost as many different forms of text as there were copies. So different copies were different. They in the form of their text. So maybe different people copied them and they translated them differently. I don't know. Between 382 and 384, he produced a new Latin version of the four Gospels and a revision of the Latin Psalter, for which he had recourse not only to the best accessible manuscripts of the Septuagint, but also to Aquila's Greek translation. This revision of the Psalter, the, quote, Roman Psalter, as it is called to distinguish it from his later Gallican Psalter and Hebrew Psalter, is held by many to be the version of the Psalter still used in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Damasus died in 384. Jerome may have been encouraged to think of himself as a possible successor, but mercifully, for the church's sake and for his own, he was not elected, and soon afterwards he left Rome for good. After 2 years' pilgrim journeys in the Near East, he settled in Bethlehem, where he established a monastery for himself and spent the rest of his life in biblical study and other literary activity. To begin with, he planned to continue revising the Latin Old Testament by reference to the Septuagint. He produced a further revision of the Psalms, for which he availed himself of Origen's Hexapla at Caesarea. This Gallican Psalter, as it is called, is the version of the Psalter reproduced to this day in editions of the Latin Vulgate. But he soon became convinced that the only satisfactory way to translate the Old Testament was to cut loose from the Septuagint and work from the original Hebrew, the Hebrew verity, as he called it. Accordingly, he gave himself to this task and completed the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Latin in 405. So this is a work that really began with Pope Damasus' assignment to him in around 382 or so, and it's gone on for over 20 years now. He completed the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Latin in 405. The original assignment, he extended it as he gained interest in taking it further and accomplishing more with it. This work included a further version of the Psalter, the Hebrew Psalter, a rendering direct from the original. Religious conservatism, however, preferred to go on using the more familiar wording based on the Septuagint. A footnote explains similarly the Great Bible version of the Psalms in 1539, naturally used in the Edwardian editions of the Book of Common Prayer, 1549 and 1552 editions, was not replaced by the superior Authorized Version and King James Version rendering when the prayer book was repromulgated in 1662, but remains in use to this day. For this work, Jerome needed to perfect his knowledge of Hebrew and did not hesitate to rely on the help of Jewish teachers. Of these, he mentions three: a Jew from Tiberias who helped him with the translation of Chronicles, one from Lydda, Lydda, quote, reputed to be of the highest standing among the Hebrews, end quote, whom he hired to help him to understand the book of Job, and Baranina, who came to him by night at Bethlehem, quote, like another Nicodemus, fearing the disapproval of his fellow Jews if he were known to give this kind of assistance to a Christian. I'm going to go back here. So of these he mentions three: a Jew from Tiberias who helped him with the translation of Chronicles, one from Lydda, reputed to be of the highest standing among the Hebrews, whom he hired to help him to understand the book of Job, and Baranina, who came to him by night at Bethlehem, quote, like another Nicodemus, to give him lessons in Hebrew. And then for the parenthetical there on like another Nicodemus says, fearing the disapproval of his fellow Jews if he were known to give this kind of assistance to a Christian. So in other words, Baranina came to him by night at Bethlehem as a Jew, came to him by night because he didn't want other Jews to see him going to help a Christian with Scripture. Jerome's dependence on Jewish instructors increased the suspicion of some of his Christian critics, who were put off in any case by such an innovation as a translation of the sacred writings from Hebrew with its implied disparagement of the divinely inspired Septuagint. And I just noticed I have gone well over the 20-minute limit. So I'm going to stop right there for now, and next session we will continue with chapter 6, the Christian Canon, Old Testament in the Latin West. Thank you for watching.